Hello and welcome to this Lloyd's Register webinar. During the course of this webinar, leading specialists from our regulatory affairs and newly formed advisory team will provide clear, comprehensive analysis and insights into the outcomes of the IMO's recent MEPC 83 session and the upcoming regulatory milestones for strategic implementation. In a time of constantly shifting global change and a massive news headlines, our experts will take time during this session to provide analysis of the regulations given effect to the midterm GHG measures, outline upcoming regulatory milestones for strategic implementation, and provide guidance to enable confident decision-making amid regulatory change. The webinar will run for 1 hour, with each of our two experts speakers providing a presentation, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. Microphones will be muted, the webinar will be recorded and made available afterwards. So, if you have any questions for our experts as we go along, please pop them in the chat, which you can find on the right hand of the screen. Any questions we don't have time to answer today, we will collate into a written Q&A document and send out to all of our clients and today's webinar subscribers. I'm delighted today to be joined by Andy Wibrow, Lead Specialist from our Regulatory Affairs team, and Jack Pringle, Head of LR Energy Transition Advisory, who joins us today online from Singapore. Andy, over to you please for your analysis on the outcomes of MEPC 83.
Thank you, Lucy. So I will, before getting into the detail of the regulatory outcome, give some context as to what MEPC 83 had set out and what its next steps are. So for those not familiar with the IMO, MEPC is the IMO's Marine Environment Protection Committee, responsible for all things to do with regulation for counter pollution and pollution prevention from ships. So this session we are specifically looking at the MARPOL Convention, Annex 6, which looks at air emissions, and that's the instrument to which has been or will be amended to implement the midterm measures. So if we wind the clock back, in 2018, the IMO's MEPC adopted an initial GHG reduction strategy, which set out a variety of targets, ambitions, and a vision. And in 2023, that was revised to what is colloquially referred to as the revised GHG strategy, which, as you see on screen, contains a vision which sets out the IMO's continued commitment to decarbonising shipping. It also included a variety of ambitions, two of which were most relevant to the MEPC 83 meeting. One was on uptake of zero or near zero GHG emission technologies and fuels. And the other, more critically, was around total GHG emissions reduction. So this was to peak GHG emissions from international shipping as soon as possible and to reach net zero by or around 2050. And that led to what is now in the draft regulatory amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 in the draft new Chapter 5, which sets out a goal for achieving that in a regulatory context. So getting into what the IMO MEPC 83 approved, so it approved a set of draft amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 with an application to ships of 5,000 gross tons or above, with some exceptions. So the exceptions are they will not apply to ships operating solely within the waters of their flag state. So if you have a ship that is registered and flagged with a state and it operates exclusively in that state's waters, the regulations do not apply. There is a statement in the draft regulations for that flag administration to set equivalent arrangements, but the underpinning MARPOL regulations wouldn't apply. There's also exceptions for ships not using mechanical propulsion and also FPSOs, drilling rigs, and semi-submersible vessels. When we get into the detail of the new chapter, the new draft Chapter 5, there's a scope of what is being regulated. So traditionally in regulations like EEDI, EEXI, and the Carbon Intensity Indicator, CII, the IMO has traditionally regulated what is referred to as tank to wake emissions. So they are the emissions that are emitted by a ship specific on board. So from the consumer unit or the engine into the atmosphere is what's referred to as tank to wake emissions. Now in this new draft chapter 5 of MARPOL Annex 6, there will also be regulation of the well to tank portion. So that's all of the emissions associated with the feedstock of the fuel, refinery, transport of the fuel, all the way to the bunker point. So throughout the rest of this presentation, I'll be referring to well to wake emissions. So that's the scope of the regulation. So it will be covering both portions, both the tank to wake on board emissions as well as the upstream emissions associated with the production of the fuel. And the other big change is traditionally the IMO has only regulated carbon dioxide. It will now be regulating methane and nitrous oxide emissions as well. All of those emissions will be considered in a GHG intensity standard, which I'm now going to get into the detail of. So each energy source will be assessed in terms of its GHG, well to wake GHG emissions per unit of energy. So the equation given to do that is measured in terms of grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. The equivalent refers to a methodology of assessing an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide for the methane and nitrous oxide emissions associated with that energy source. So in all of the equations throughout the regulations, it refers to grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. That's for each individual energy source or fuel. A ship on an annual basis will then be required to conduct an assessment of its weighted average of all energy sources. So there'll be a requirement to surmise all of those GFIs, so the equation at the top of the screen, and give a weighted average of the ship's performance through the year. So in this second formula, EI subscript J refers to the GHG intensity of each energy source. Then that is multiplied by the amount of energy from that source. That is all surmised and then divided by the total energy used by that ship in a year. And that will give a ship its attained GFI through the year. That's then assessed against a target or two targets, and each of those are calculated through the formula you see at the bottom of the three, and that is done by multiplying a reference GFI, a reference GHG fuel intensity, which is set at 93.3 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule, and that is multiplied by a reduction factor, ZT. At the bottom, you see a graph which shows us the reduction trajectory that has been set. So those Z factors, the reductions from the date of operation of the regulation through time. It's important to note that the IMO has set in the draft regulations reduction factors through to 2035, with a further factor in 2040 for what is referred to as the base reduction target. So there are two plots here, the top one, the red one, which is referred to as the base trajectory, and then the bottom, which is referred to as the direct compliance target or trajectory. And those will make a bit more sense when we come on to looking at those in more detail. But for now, it's just important to note that targets have been set up to 2035 with a requirement for those to be reviewed through time. What we expect in terms of a workflow from the operation of the regulations is economic operators in the marine fuel production market to submit via member states of the IMO to MEPC proposed emissions factors for the well-to-wake pathway of the fuel production. That will then be included in the IMO's life cycle assessment guidelines, which will then be used for assessment by ships going forward. So then fuels would be delivered with a what's termed a fuel life cycle label, which will include all of the information required for assessment of that fuel in terms of its GHG intensity. IMO will simultaneously recognise sustainable fuel certification schemes, which will assess and audit those economic operators to ensure that they are producing fuels in line with those agreed emissions factors. And from that point, the operator will collect information from the fuel lifecycle label and go forward in assessing the attained GFI of each ship. Taking a closer look at the reduction trajectories, the two pathways, so the base and the strive reduction trajectories, are linked to the 2023 GHG strategy set by IMO. So the direct compliance, the green plot, the one at the bottom, is linked to the, in inverted commas, striving for level of ambition or indicative checkpoints, which requires a 30% total GHG reduction in 2030 and 80% in 2040, both compared to 2008 levels. And the base, the red trajectory, is linked to the base checkpoints, which requires a 20% total GHG reduction in 2030 and a 70% in 2040. As I said earlier, the figures between 2028 and 2035 are set in the draft regulations. There's an element of uncertainty between 2036 and 2040, where these will need to be determined. However, there is a limit set for the base trajectory in 2040. From that point onwards, it's less clear, and it's understood that further figures would be set in 5 yearly reviews. So the regulations for the middle portion here, the 2036 to 2040, have to be determined by January 2032, and then going forward beyond 2040, the IMO would conduct further reviews of the effectiveness of the regulation and set further reductions. So if you're wondering what this all means and why there are two reduction trajectories, we'll now look at a case study to give this some context. So if we assume an attained GFI, hypothetically, of 70 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule for a ship, which is on this graph is the black dashed plot. We have the base and the direct compliance trajectories or plots. So the red at the top, which is the base, and the green, the lower one, which is the direct compliance. If the GFI of this ship, which, as I said, for illustrative purposes is set as 70, if it is less than both the direct compliance and the base trajectory, the ship is considered compliant. And in this case, the 70 is less than the direct compliance between the years 2028 and 2031. And the ship will generate surplus compliance, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail shortly. But for the time being, in this portion of time, a ship achieving a GFI of 70 would be in direct compliance and achieve a surplus for this period of time. Then moving into a block of period for the same ship between 2031 and 2034, the ship will have a GFI, so GHG intensity, less than the base target, the red plot, but greater than the direct compliance green plot. So what it will now accrue is what's referred to in the regulations as tier 1 non-compliance, where we'll have a tier 1 deficit equal to the difference between its attained GFI, so the black dash plot, and the direct compliance target, the green plot, which will need to be balanced, and we'll come on to that. And then in 2034 and beyond, again for this this illustration, the attained black dash, the attained GFI of 70 is now greater than both the base target, the red plot, and the direct compliance target, the green plot. So for the portion of the non-compliance between the green and the red plot is considered tier 1, a tier 1 deficit, and the difference between the attained GFI and the red plot, the base target, is considered tier 2, a tier 2 deficit, and both of those will need to be balanced, and we'll come onto that shortly, how that happens. So as I said in the previous slide, or in the previous slides, if a ship's annual attained GFI is less than or equal to the direct compliance target, the ship is considered in compliance, it's in direct compliance. And that will lead to a ship obtaining a statement of compliance, which will allow the ship to operate and demonstrate compliance with this draft chapter 5 of MARPOL Annex 6. And then in the previous slide, I referred to 2 tiers of compliance deficit. Where a ship accrues a tier 2 deficit, so that's the attained GFI is greater than the base target in a given year, it has some options as to what it can do to balance that. So remedial units can be purchased from a central IMO register at a rate set in the regulations of $380 US per ton of CO2 emissions equivalent. So the equivalent, again, referring to the 3 emissions within scope, so that's CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Where a tier 1 deficit is experienced, so the attained GFI is greater than the direct compliance, there's only one option in the regulation to balance that, and that is that has to be balanced through the purchase of remedial units from an IMO central register. And that rate for the tier 1 remedial unit is set in the regulations at $100 US per ton of CO2 equivalent. If that approach is taken, so the ship purchases remedial units to balance the tier 2 and tier 1 compliance deficit, it will then receive again a statement of compliance and be able to demonstrate compliance with the chapter 5 of MARPOL Annex 6. I mentioned earlier that there are some options with regards to tier 2 compliance balancing. So one of the options I explained before is the purchase of what's referred to as a remedial unit in a IMO central GFI register. There's another option, which is to effectively trade or transfer surplus credits, or what are referred to as surplus units. So in this example, ship A was over compliant, so its GFI was lower than the direct compliance target, and receive surplus units. It can then trade those, can transfer them to another ship. So in this example, ship B had a tier 2 deficit, and it can balance that tier 2 deficit from the obtained surplus units from ship A, and then that would make ship B compliant, and it can then receive a statement of compliance and operate. It's understood that at this stage that will work through private agreement between ships, and so there would effectively be a private market for the trading of surplus units where they are accrued by over-compliant ships. It's understood that the maximum or the cap for trade for each unit would be equal to the remedial unit price for a tier 2 unit. So that would be a maximum of $380 US per ton of CO2. As to charge more than that would be more than a ship could buy direct from the IMO's register. There is another part of the regulation that says that a tier 2 deficit can be balanced through what is referred to as banked surplus units. So in this example, in year 1, a ship is over compliant, so it outperforms the direct compliance target, and it banks those units in the IMO's central GFI register, and does so again in year 2, and then in year 3 experiences a tier 2 deficit, and it takes some of those surplus units out of its banked sort of pot of surplus units to balance those, and would again lead to a statement of compliance and ability to demonstrate compliance with these regulations. However, it should be noted that the regulations set a maximum lifespan for a surplus unit. So that is set at 2 years beyond the year they are issued. So we have a question with regards to if, whilst the regulations allow surplus units to be banked and then later used, we are unsure at this point if that is physically possible. So in addition to the need to pay for balancing a compliance deficit, so either through purchasing remedial units from the central IMO GFI register, or purchasing of surplus units through private transaction from other ships that were over compliant in a year, there will be a need, or there is a need set out in the regulations to pay an administrative fee for the upkeep of the central IMO GFI register. At this point, that rate is not set, so that is to come in further detail. But that is to ensure the running of this central registry. And the purpose of that central registry is to issue credits, surplus units, to ships that are in direct compliance and have outperformed the direct compliance target, to manage a bank of surplus units for each ship, to issue remedial units to ships that have purchased them, so either at the tier 1 or tier 2 rate, depending on which type of compliance deficit is being balanced, and to record the transfer of surplus units between ships. So where there is private transaction between ships, the register will track which unit was transferred to which ship. So it's important to appreciate that whilst a compliance deficit can be balanced through more than one route, so if you had a large deficit, that could be balanced through purchasing of remedial units for one portion of that deficit, and also the transfer of through private transaction of surplus units from other ships. But each unit, so each surplus unit or remedial unit, can only be used once. So if a surplus unit is banked, it cannot later be transferred to another ship. And if a remedial unit is purchased, it has to be used to balance a deficit at that point. So the bottom line there is, when a surplus unit is issued, so if in a year a ship is over compliant compared to the direct compliance target and is issued surplus units, the destiny of those surplus units needs to be decided at that point. There's also an option in the regulations for financial reward for ships using what's referred to as ZNZ energy and fuels, so zero or near zero GHG emission technologies and fuels, which again in the regulations is referred to as ZNZ. While the detail for how this would work is to come in guidance, it's understood at this point that the reward will be set in terms of dollars per, again, US dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent for the difference between a threshold and the attained GFI. So the threshold is set in the regulations for an initial period. So it's set at 19 for an initial period, and then in 2035 that drops to 14 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And in this example, if a ship had if a fuel source had achieved a GFI of 16, the reward it would be eligible for would be the difference between the 19 threshold and its attained GFI of 16. Again, these are working assumptions. A lot of this detail is to come in guidance. So there's going to be a phase in terms of what ships need to do and by when. So there's a timeline that will get us to business as usual. So in Assuming the regulations are adopted at an extraordinary session of the MEPC this autumn in October, that will set a timeline for entry into force of the regulations, and the end of that timeline will be 1st of March in 2027 is when the regulations would enter force. During the first meeting of the MEPC after the regulations enter force, there will be a need to recognise fuel certification schemes. So those are the schemes that will audit fuel producers to ensure that they are producing fuels sustainably on a pathway that they are claiming to use. Simultaneously, fuel pathways will receive throughout the rest of 2027, fuels will receive certification from those recognised schemes. Ships would need to submit an amended version of their ship energy efficiency management plan to demonstrate how this new data with relation to GHG intensity will be collected, and that will need to be approved by the administration or a recognised organisation acting on behalf of the flag. And ships will also be required to register for an account with the central IMO GFI register by the autumn of 2027. From January of 2028 through to December, ships will need to start collecting data related to the fuels and energy sources they use in accordance with the approved ship energy efficiency management plan. So if you recall, I said before, in 2027, the SEMP will need to be amended to reflect how this data will be collected. And then in 2028, the data needs to be collected. In 2029 and onward, ships will then need to submit that data for verification and compliance review. And that from 2029 onwards will take us into what we could consider business as usual. And the business as usual would look something like this. So that would be from 1st of January each year through to 31st of March. A ship will report to its administration or RO the attained GFI of the ship based on the data collected in the previous year. The administration or the RO between 1st of April and 30th of June each year will verify that data and verify the attained GFI and upload that information to the IMO GFI register. Between the 1st and the 31st of July each year, the ship will need to go into the GFI register in its account and conduct any compliance balancing. So we'll have a 1-month window to decide what it's going to do if it receives surplus units, if it's going to transfer those to another ship through private transaction, or if it's going to bank its surplus units. And with regards to any compliance deficit, it will also in that month need to decide and input into the GFI register how it's going to balance the deficit. So it would be that a tier 1 deficit only through purchase of remedial units, or if there's a tier 2 deficit as well, if it's going to receive surplus units from another ship or purchase remedial units through the register. And then in August, the register will issue an account statement which will show the transactions which were made in the previous month, and will make that available to the administration or the administration's RO for the administration or RO to verify that the compliance approaches have been fulfilled and that any deficit has been balanced, and then issue a statement of compliance which will subsequently be uploaded to the register, and that is the method of demonstrating compliance with these new requirements. As I said at the very start of this, while MEPC approved draft regulations, draft amendments to MARPOL Annex 6, much of the detail is still to come in supporting guidelines. There are a total of 10 sets of guidelines that need to be developed, and there are 4 existing guidelines that require amendment. So there's a significant amount of work that needs to happen between now and the entry into force of the regulations. So these include further development of the SEMP guidelines. So currently IMO has guidelines on how to develop a ship energy efficiency management plan. They will need to be amended to give guidance on what needs to be included in revisions to the SEMP. there'll be significant development needed to the IMO's life cycle GHG intensity guidelines, both to give methodology for controlling sustainability of fuels, for example, things like biofuels. There will be a lot more detail required on sustainability criteria for such fuels, as well as including emissions factors within the guidelines for fuels in general to allow calculation of a GFI. There'll be need for guidelines on verification to explain in detail the steps that will need to be taken by an administration or its RO, including how to assess the compliance balancing of the ship. There are also guidelines for the opening and management of a ship account, which will include the administration fee. So that will be essential to demonstrate or to communicate what the administration fee is, as well as the methodology for opening an account in the register. There's also going to need to be guidelines on requirements and procedures for certification schemes for fuels to give the criteria for a candidate scheme. So the standards it would need to meet and the methodology for assessing such schemes for the IMO to recognise them. And there will in terms of these sort of key guidelines, there'll also need to be guidelines on defining zero or near zero energy sources and fuels, both in terms of what the reward for using those fuels and energy sources would be, and a methodology for determining such rewards. So all roads lead to the extraordinary session of the MEPC in October, which is expected to adopt the regulations, but it's also expected to develop a work plan to deliver all of these further guidelines and detail that's needed to give us the full picture. So that's it from me. I'll hand back to Lucy.
Thank you, Andy, for that extremely valuable insight on the outcomes of MEPC 83. I now want to hand over to you, please, Jack, for an in-depth look at how to translate those regulatory changes into practical strategies.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy, and thanks, Andy, for the very insightful overview of the midterm measures. I'm going to sort of build on Andy's presentation and have a look at sort of three things really. One is provide you with an introduction to LR Energy Transition Advisory. Secondly, just have a look at how we are supporting clients from across the maritime value chain to tackle some of these complex regulatory challenges, and then have a look at a case study of how we've been developing vessel compliance plans. So just to kick off with briefly an introduction to LR Energy Transition Advisory. So our sort of broad approach here is to build on the very strong technical expertise across the LR organization and provide a commercial understanding and sort of management consultancy and business strategy frameworks to tackle these complex energy transition challenges, looking at these challenges both from a technical and commercial angle. And we've been working with ship owners, charterers and fuel producers to tackle these challenges head on. Just to put some numbers around this, we've sort of been advising over 50% of the LNG cargo market, over 2/3 of the dry bulk cargo market, and we've supported over 10 of the world's largest fuel producers to develop their alternative fuel strategies. So how have we been supporting our clients so far? So, as we've seen from Andy's presentation, there's a number of sort of quite tricky challenges that drop out of the midterm measures, and particularly the GFI sort of mechanism. So the primary challenge here is, how do you handle your compliance with GFI? So what are the optimal measures that can be taken across existing ships to limit the compliance deficit and ensure that those vessels are attractive in the market, but then also how do you make future-proof long-term fleet decisions around the right fuel and technology and so on. So what I'd say is we've sort of been working with clients across 5 broad topics, really. Firstly being the development of fleet and pooling strategies. So looking at how shipping stakeholders can take advantage of surplus. Of course, we've seen that a lot from FuelEU Maritime thus far, but this will also apply to the GFI. Secondly, looking at individual vessel compliance plans, and I'll take you through a case study of one of these plans over the rest of the presentation. But this is all about taking an individual asset and building up a chain of solutions that can be applied to that asset to help keep that vessel in compliance as cheaply and as cost effectively as possible. The third element is obviously looking at future fuel markets. So GFI is very much designed to drive the uptake of low GHG intensity fuels. And what I sort of say to every client is, in order to make those decisions around which fuel to choose for new builds or retrofits, you really need to understand the underlying markets there, whether it's demand and supply balances, production costs, demand side costs, and of course the emissions intensity as well. Then the fourth element is all around technologies and energy saving devices. So we do a lot of technology feasibility studies, helping clients choose the right efficiency technologies for individual assets or fleets of assets. Of course, looking at both the technical and economic cases behind that. And that's an interesting one because, of course, GFI is derived from the fuel that a vessel is consuming. So installing energy saving devices won't reduce the GFI value, but what they will do is reduce the total energy consumption of the vessel, which, as Andy showed us, is part of the metric. Therefore reducing the compliance balance. And then finally, when we talk about future fuels, we need to talk about fuel procurement strategies. The structure of alternative fuel markets is inherently different to the fuel and bunker markets that we operate within today. Ultimately we're in a position where buyers of maritime fuels have very, very low amounts of buying power. So, it's very important that fuel buyers start to build out long-term fuel procurement strategies, looking at the different kind of mechanisms that can be applied to secure supply at a competitive and feasible price point. So now what I want to do is just jump into the case study of the vessel compliance plan and just walk you through that. So to start with, I just wanted to present basically the framework that we use for these sorts of studies. So I would say it's a fairly simple framework. Essentially, we follow 3 core steps. We always start with a baseline exercise. That baseline exercise essentially looks at understanding where an individual vessel or fleet of vessels sits today with regards to its compliance, whether that be GFI, CII, EU ETS and FuelEU, and look at the gap to compliance. So setting the scene of the problem that we need to solve. Where do we sit today, and how much do we need to reduce the emissions intensity of that vessel? We then move into the second phase, which is all around looking at the different levers that an individual vessel or fleet can pull to reduce emissions and improve those sort of compliance curves. So here we look at any a wide number of levers, ranging from operational optimization to looking at fuel mix, such as biofuels, looking into energy saving devices, and even going into larger scale options around large scale retrofits and fleet replacement and so on. We analyze each of those levers independently in detail, to really understand the cost benefit of each one. So we're looking at, of course, the technical improvement potential of each lever, but also the commercial case or the economic case that sits underneath it, to really understand which options are optimal for that particular vessel and that particular business. And then in the third phase, we build up a compliance pathway. So this is essentially building that chain of solutions that will help that individual vessel comply with a trajectory and minimize those regulatory costs over its remaining life. And here we typically look at two pathway options. The first and foremost is we always look at a cost optimization pathway. So let's minimize capex and comply with regulations as cheaply as possible. The second one is we'd always also look at what I call an operational excellence pathway, which is where we look at maximizing efficiency, and even, you know, and that can open up some options around life extension and so on. And essentially the output of these studies is an individual vessel plan to say over the next 5 to 10 years, this is, you know, the series of initiatives that should be taken across this vessel to help it comply with the regulations. So let's have a look at a case of applying this methodology. So what I've done here is I've taken an Aframax tanker that burns on average 6,000 metric tons of HFO. I've excluded pilot fuel from this analysis just for simplicity purposes. But just focusing on the left-hand chart, very similar to what Andy showed, you know, burning a fossil fuel, you're going to be above both target GFI curves, so above both the base and direct targets, which means you're going to be generating a deficit from 2028 onwards. So in the HFO case, those penalties are going to ramp up very quickly. So what we're talking about here is in 2040, where I've assumed some trajectories. What we're looking at is around 15,000 tons of CO2 equivalent compliance deficit. Now, if we roll up all of that compliance deficit over that timeline from 2028 to 2040, and apply the the remedial unit costs that Andy took us through, the $100 for tier 1 and $380 for tier 2, we get to a total regulatory cost of $34.2 million. So that's going to be well over half of the fuel bill for that vessel over that period of time. So that just quantifies the size of the challenge here, that this is going to hit conventionally fueled vessels. So these vessels need to work out the measures that can be taken to reduce those costs. So let's just do something fairly simple. Let's just take the same vessel and switch it over to B30. So the vessel runs 100% on B30 each year. So what we can see is that attained GFI drops down from 91.6 grams of CO2 per megajoule to 68.85. So in the first 4 years, the vessel now is generating surplus, which, as we saw, can be either used to pool with the rest of a fleet of vessels, or can be sold for other vessels to use. But what we see is from 2032 onwards, that vessel then is the attained GFI is exceeding the direct target GFI, and then from 2035 onwards is also directing the base target as well. So the remedial units are being generated from 2032 onwards. And to put some numbers around that, if we take all of those remedial units, apply the dollar values, we get to a total cost of around $13.1 million over that period of 2032 to 2040. So in short, B30 is a strong measure for those first 3 to 4 years, but it's not a long-term solution. So we need to go one step further. Just to build on this and look at the final slide of this case. What I've done here is I've taken that same vessel running on B30, but what I've done now is basically ramped up the amount of biofuel that the vessel will use between 2028 to 2040. So we're starting in 2028 at B30, and we're ending up in 2040 at B90, essentially. And the idea here is basically, let's keep the vessel as close to that target compliance line as possible, i.e. minimize the compliance deficit. What I've also done to help reduce those costs is apply ESDs. So I've assumed a 10% net energy consumption saving from ESDs with a capex of $3 million US. So what we can see from the curve is that vessel, as you increase the amount of biofuel, the line starts to zigzag down. So we're reducing the GFI and trying to keep that compliance deficit to a minimum. And that's shown on the bottom left chart, where we're showing those surplus units being generated, but then the remedial units also being generated. The positive here is those remedial units are tier 1 units, so they're the $100 per ton units. So it's going to result in cheaper compliance costs. So let's do a quick comparison across the 3 cases we've looked at. So if I look at the right-hand chart here, I've basically just done a total cost of ownership calculation. So I've rolled up the costs over the 2028 to 2040 period. And I'm looking at fuel bill, the GFI remedial unit costs, the energy saving device capex, and the value of the surplus units. So starting at the top, we've got our HFO case. So we see that the fuel bill is the lowest of all cases at around 40.5 million. But the penalties are the highest at 34.2 million. That's because you're generating deficit from year 1. So that results in a total cost of ownership of that vessel over that period of time of around $75 million. But let's remember, it's out of compliance from 2028 onwards. The B30 case, similar case, we reduce those GFI penalties down to 13 million, but our fuel bill goes up because of the cost of biofuel being greater than HFO. So fuel bill goes up to around 56. But we reduce that total cost of ownership down to 69 million. But again, remember, we're in deficit and out of compliance with the targets from 2032 onwards. So if we look at the biofuel plus ESD case, which is this one I'm looking at on this slide, we reduce the total cost of ownership down to 63.5 million. So that's an $11.2 million dollar drop from our HFO case, which is around 15%. So it's really considerable. Our fuel bill has we've added around 50% to the fuel bill. It's gone up to 60 million. That's because of the cost of biofuel. But our GFI penalties have gone down to just 200,000. So you can see that although the fuel bill goes up, the reduction in penalties will offset that in this case. Plus, you've got an added benefit of you've generated 6,727 surplus units, which, as Andy has explained, can be sold back into the market or used in your own pool. And this opens up quite an interesting question: is what is the actual value of a surplus unit? And actually, I think this is a function of, of course, the cost of a tier 2 remedial unit, so 380 USDs per ton of CO2 equivalent, but it's also a function of the alternative measures that can reduce that compliance deficit, which for any vessel, even if it's alternative, an alternative fueled vessel, is going to be biofuels. So the value of the surplus unit will be somehow related to the cost of biofuels. But if we were to assume, just taking that kind of a nominal market price of 380 USD per tonne of CO2 equivalent, so just taking the tier 2 remedial unit cost, that vessel can generate essentially $2.6 million in value by basically selling those 6,727 surplus units. So what we see here is by taking a vessel that was inherently, in a pretty bad state of affairs from the sort of the GFI perspective, and building up that sort of chain of solutions using biofuels and ESDs, we can reduce the total cost of ownership by over $10 million, and we can keep that vessel in compliance and actually generate additional pooling value through producing those surplus units. So the business case for doing this sort of modeling is very much there. The savings are there, the opportunities are there within the sort of the challenges that are being generated by these regulations. But what I would always recommend to clients is to do this sort of analysis, get into the numbers and understand where those opportunities lie and how you can future-proof your fleet. So with that, I will pass back to Lucy to take us through the Q&A.
Hello, and thank you for that, Jack. That was really brilliant input and made things a lot clearer for me. We have been absolutely inundated with questions this afternoon. We've had in excess of 200, which is extraordinary. So I'm conscious we haven't got much time left in our session, so we'll get through a few questions now. And just as a reminder to everybody, we will be sending out a summary, comprehensive summary of all the answers to today's questions, even those we haven't got the time to answer in person today. And a copy of this recording will also be sent to all subscribers to today's webinar, and will also be available to download from our LinkedIn profile later this evening. So I'm joined here today by Andy and Jack to answer a few questions. So let's get on with them. Okay, so Andy, a question for you. You mentioned that the regulations apply to ships operating only in waters of their flag states. Does this mean that emissions emitted by, say, a Greek flagship globally outside of Greek waters will be allowed to emit without paying?
So I think there's potentially a slight misunderstanding in what I was trying to get at. So there's a general application to ships of 5,000 gross tonnage or above, and there are some exceptions. So that's one of the exceptions. So if you are operating solely within the waters of your flag state, you are exempt from the regulations. So it's the inverse of the question.
Okay, thank you. And a further one for you: can surplus units be used to offset both tier 2 and tier 1 deficit?
So in the regulations, it sets out that tier 1 deficit must be balanced by the purchase of remedial units at the tier 1 rate of $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. The tier 2 deficit, there are options for balancing that deficit, which is either the purchase of remedial units at a tier 2 rate of $380 per ton of CO2 equivalent, by using banked surplus units from previous years, although noting the caveat we mentioned about the expiry of those, or from receiving surplus units from another ship.
Okay, and can the surplus compliance be transferred to only one ship or multiple ships?
So if you have, so each individual surplus unit can be used for one purpose. If a ship generates multiple units, it can transfer them to different ships. So hypothetically, if you generate 10 surplus units, you can give 5 to one ship and 5 to a different ship. Okay.
Another question along a similar subject: how can the IMO regulate the price of surplus units traded? The question posed says it's a commercial transaction.
Yeah, so our understanding is that that's exactly right, that it'll be a commercial transaction. The IMO will not regulate what fee is set. In Jack's portion of the presentation, he talks about what is the price of a surplus unit, and that being a function of the tier 2 remedial unit or the cost of compliance through purchasing a biofuel, for example. So the IMO will not set the fee, but it will track where a surplus unit is transferred from and to.
Okay. Another question for you, Andy. Once the IMO net zero strategy is adopted in October, is there any indication how this will interlink with Fuel EU Maritime?
Yeah, so this is a common question that we've seen asked both this morning or the earlier webinar today and in this one. Both regulatory regimes will exist together. So a ship calling at a port that is within the scope of the Fuel EU Maritime will have to comply with both the Fuel EU Maritime requirements and the IMO's requirements.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Andy. Jack, I've got a question for you. A ship has a useful service life of 25 to 30 years, meaning new build vessels coming into service from 2025. For them, which fuel pathway should owners choose to meet the 2050 vision?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably the number one question that owners need to answer at the minute. So unfortunately, there's not a sort of simple answer to that one, but essentially, I would always say a few things that need to be considered. If we're talking about a new build that's coming online, in the coming years, let's say, and fuel choices being sort of deliberated as part of the design, is I would always say do those sort of total cost of ownership assessments. So stack up a comparison of different fuels and different technology types, to look at what the total costs and the regulatory costs might look like over the life of the vessel, taking 25 or 30 years as an example. That allows you to do an apple-to-apple comparison. It also allows you to look at, well, how much cost you're going to be passing on to your customer, the charterers, as well. So it's an optimization challenge. How do you make your vessel as attractive as possible? For vessels, I think in the question we're talking about vessels coming online, this year. That's where they may be built, with conventional engines or so on. So that's where you need to think about, efficiency improvements on those vessels over their life, or maybe even engine conversions later in life once we see, engine conversion costing and sort of the maturity of those processes, sort of advance in the coming years.
And that's what you and your team at Advisory are there to advise on, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're doing both of those things basically. Is two core questions. What do you do with existing tonnage to squeeze out as much life from these vessels as possible, keep them in compliance for as long as possible, and keep them, attractive in the market? And then how do you future-proof those, new builds and select the right fuels and technologies to make sure that those investments are going to last the course?
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack. Thanks for joining us from Singapore. That is all the questions we've got time for now. As I said, we will take the time to collate every question sent in today and pull together a comprehensive summary and email out to everybody. I hope you found today's webinar valuable and the insight and analysis around the regulatory picture really valuable in terms of helping you build your future strategies and a greater understanding of MEPC 83 outcomes. We will be holding more in the future to help you navigate the pathway to decarbonisation. So thank you for joining, and until next time, goodbye.